We are back with part 3 in our Saturn vs. the Arcade series. In the first 2 episodes, we took a look at games from a number of different genres and how they translated once they were moved over to the Saturn. Since each of these games came from radically different hardware, it was also interesting to see how the old Saturn handled things. Sometimes you got a port that was pretty well done, and sometimes things went really bad. It was also cool to see how the Saturn fared with both 2D and 3D graphics. The hardware certainly made most 2D effects a lot easier to do, but sometimes the Saturn seemed to do an outstanding job with polygons as well, especially considering the major gulf in power that was present. That led me to choose an additional 14 titles for part 3 here, again spreading things out across different genres, graphical styles, and hardware. Each of these titles originated in the arcade first, with the Saturn release coming later. I really had fun with the first 2 episodes, and I think this one should be pretty entertaining as well. Hope you guys enjoy the Sega Saturn vs. the Arcade Part 3. When Afterburner II showed up in the arcade in 1987, it was a visual stunner. Sega had been refining its sprite scaling technology for a number of years at that point, and the new X board was its most potent yet. There were many attempts to port Afterburner II home, some better than others, but there is no question the Saturn version was a home run in pretty much every way. The 7 years that passed between the 2 hardware platforms meant the Saturn was really the first console that could do this game justice. The detail, the performance, the amount of sprites on the screen are all very similar to the point where it's tough to tell them apart. The Saturn version was part of the Sega Ages line, which was released standalone in Japan and as part of a compilation in the West. This was good on the 32X, but the Saturn is a complete package of arcade perfection. Seeing Metal Slug in the arcade when it was first released in 1996 was a sight for sore eyes. The run-and-gun genre was still alive and looking better than ever on the Neo Geo. The Saturn port showed up a year later in 1997 and used a 1MB extended RAM cartridge to help with all those glorious sprite animations. The thing is even though the Saturn was plenty powerful enough to replicate the colors, the amount of sprites on the screen, and the 2-player action, animation would still be an issue because of the CD-ROM format. While the media itself had plenty of room for the assets, the Saturn's RAM could only store a small amount of it at a time, even with the RAM cartridge. That means that though the Saturn port looks great overall, you still lose some frames of animation and of course, you add some loading between levels. But I want to be clear, to see the differences you would need to see the animations in slow motion, because the Saturn version is that close. It's an overall stellar port that captures most of what made the arcade original so much fun. At the time, Neo Geo home versions were still a big deal, and having this available was special, particularly since the PlayStation version was quite a bit inferior.
Okay, rocket launcher, over back.
I decided this go around to show a game that many shoot 'em up fans consider one of the best. Radiant Silvergun hit the arcade in May of 1998 thanks to the STV Titan arcade board. This was based on the Saturn architecture and used cartridges instead of CDs. When the Saturn version hit the home market 2 months later, it was pretty much perfect in every area that mattered. Visually, this gorgeous game is intact and as pretty as ever. You have both VDP chips pumping out some incredible on-screen effects that really set this apart from the other games in the genre. I was always impressed by this because you get all your weapons up front and even have a way to defend yourself. The real challenge of Radiant Silvergun was learning the enemy and boss patterns and choosing the correct response among your many options. It was also quite a bit different between difficulty levels. The enemy attacks you got on the easiest setting were quite a bit different than the hardest. It made it almost seem like there were multiple games wrapped up in just this one. The arcade mode stays true to the original, where you can choose your stage paths based on the story, while the Saturn mode allows you to tackle every stage. There's other ways to play it today, but the Saturn version still looks, sounds, and plays as good as shoot 'em ups get. Game Tengoku The Game Paradise was a shoot 'em up originally released in 1995 by Jaleco on their Mega System 32 arcade board. This technology was based on an NEC 32-bit CPU and a VDP that was capable of some pretty robust sprite and background scaling. This vertical shooter was set in an arcade that is under attack, and you must use various Jaleco characters to defend it. It's done in a very humorous style and is loaded with all kinds of cool animations and scaling effects. Nearly 2 years later, in 1997, the Saturn got a port of it, complete with extra stages, expanded cinematics, and a Tate mode to preserve the original presentation. Side by side, the results speak for themselves. The Saturn nails the look and feel pretty much spot on. You might be able to scrutinize some animation differences here, but I can't say I noticed anything significant, and most of the scaling effects seem present as well. The gameplay can be really tough based on the character you choose, and the difficulty in general will likely squash casual players in both versions. The Saturn had a special Paradise Edition that came with a VHS tape that presumably contained additional promotional and story details about the game. There's lots of great little touches in this one, but you're gonna need some serious dedication to see it all.
Ready to fight. Power up! Homing blocker! Point up! Point up! Point up! Dead graviton! Power up! Point up! Point up! Point up!
Here we go, this is the big one. In 1994, Sega released Virtua Fighter 2, the fully textured map sequel to the original one-on-one fighting classic. This was done on the Model 2, which at the time was one of the most powerful and advanced arcade technologies on the market, and every aspect of this game's presentation was impressive. It was smooth as silk, with some of the most convincing animation a fighting game ever had. The three-dimensional backgrounds were especially nice, and no one that saw it back then walked away from that bridge stage unimpressed. A home port to the Saturn was guaranteed to see cutbacks and changes thanks to the differences in technology, but I don't think anyone ever thought we'd get as good as we got. The Saturn game runs at 704 by 480 and 60 frames per second, a feat no other home console of that era could duplicate. The trade-off there was a loss of the three-dimensional backgrounds, now replaced by multiple layers of two-dimensional images. There is no question this impacts the overall visual excellence of the arcade, but I think you still have to admire the skills of Sega's developers in getting the game looking and running this good on the Saturn. The most important aspect, the gameplay, is spot on incredible. It's lightning fast and has all the moves of the arcade original. Virtua Fighter 2 would go on to be a huge hit for Sega in the arcade, and it was the Saturn's best-selling title by quite a stretch. Fortunately, it's cheap today and a must-own for those with original hardware.
Fight! 1, ready, go!
Primal Rage was originally an arcade release in 1994. It pits dinosaurs and giant apes against one another in not so Mortal Kombat. It features digitized and pre-rendered graphics that were popular at the time, which gives the game a unique spin thanks to the monstrous combatants and post-apocalyptic setting. This was ported home to most of the consoles of the day, and the Saturn version stands up fairly well among them. The arcade does seem to have more animation frames, clearer sound, and the sprites seem a tad bit larger, but I don't think fans will pay it much mind otherwise. The gameplay in this one never felt quite right to me. It's probably because I was a Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat fan at that time, but those special moves just don't come off smoothly in comparison. I know people love it, so I might be in the minority there. Still, I can't help but to admit that there is a certain visceral appeal of seeing giant godlike creatures ripping each other to shreds. This one was a big part of the US video game violence debate back in the mid-90s, when a mother watched her preteen son execute the piss fatality in the Genesis version. It re-sparked the national debate on the rating system, though it was never rated anything higher than T for teen on any platform.
Rage.
When Capcom released X-Men vs. Street Fighter in the arcade, it was an instant smash success. Running on the CPS2 arcade board, it was one of the best looking 2D games in its time, thanks to the outstanding animation and screen-filling special attacks. Being released in 1996 after the introduction of the new generation of consoles, none of them really had any chance of replicating this in any form. The 2 vs 2 action meant that a home port would need loads of space to store all the animations. The Nintendo 64 was strangled by the cartridge format, and the Saturn and PlayStation simply didn't have enough internal RAM to hold all those glorious moves. But Capcom and Sega had an ace in the hole thanks to the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, which boosted the Saturn's memory just enough to give us the port we all deserved. Just take a look at this beauty side by side with the original. Yes, there is a difference in screen resolution here, but you just can't get closer to the arcade outside of high-end emulation. Sprite size, backgrounds, animation, and everything in between is so close it was as if the arcade machine was sitting right there in your living room. I love the way Capcom changed everything we knew about Street Fighter with this one. Not only were the special attacks and super moves now amped up, but the end boss fight was against a screen-sized apocalypse that could decimate a life bar in seconds. It was gorgeous, fun to play, and only the Saturn could bring it home at this level.
Boom! Ready.
Come on, mon ami.
Fight! Juggernaut punch! Ow! Earthquake!
Kinetic card. Cajun strike.
Ow! Earthquake! Yeah! Boom! Ready.
Come on, mon ami.
Fight! Juggernaut punch! Earthquake! Ow! Ow!
Kinetic card. Cajun strike. Kinetic card.
Earthquake!
Model 2 arcade games were a sight to behold way back in the 1990s. Not only were they some of the prettiest polygon games available, but they always had some element that really made them stand out. That was certainly true of the House of the Dead, a 1996 multiplayer gun game that pitted you against hordes of the undead and other biological nightmares. You could shoot off arms, blow holes in chests, and of course aim for the head. Thing is, not every creature had the same weak spot. You had to learn the best place to hit these guys, otherwise they'd keep attacking you. When the Saturn port came home in 1998, it was handled by an outside studio called Tantalus Interactive, and it's clear they had neither the time nor the manpower to do it justice visually. The game is ugly and a mere shell of the arcade on which it's based. Textures appear incomplete, the performance chugs regularly, and nearly every aspect of the enemy models has seen a large reduction in polygons. Despite being ugly as sin and nowhere near as pretty as the arcade, it maintained the fun factor thanks to its on-rails nature. This is, at its heart, all about target practice, and in that scope, it succeeds on a resounding level. Blowing parts off of a zombie is still fun no matter how poor they may look. Add in a second player and it gets even better. It was the rare case where graphics didn't really matter when it was all said and done. This was about the fun of blasting bad guys with a friend, and it was glorious in that regard.
No! Thank you. This is terrible.
Die Hard Arcade is one of the strangest Sega releases of that era. The arcade version was done on the STV Titan and released in 1997 as a joint venture between Sega AM1 and Sega Technical Institute. As the story goes, Sega had a ton of STV boards in the warehouse and an unused Die Hard license, so this was the result. I would have much rather have had a 3D Streets of Rage, but you know, this game ended up pretty fun itself. Essentially, you move area to area beating down bad guys en route to saving the president's daughter. It's got lots of weapons and melee attacks to choose from, and it's 2 players. The Saturn version, since the arcade is based on its chipset, is of course 100% perfect, right down to the mesh transparencies. It's still a fairly good-looking game, all things considered. You won't mistake it for a Model 2 title, but when multiple enemies come together in the 3D environments, everything goes together great. Each area is sewn together with QuickTime events that, if failed, can cost you some life, or even force you to battle enemies you otherwise could have avoided. I can't stress enough how much more fun this one is with a second player in tow. It goes from a standard beat 'em up to one that really holds your attention, especially with that Double Dragon style ending. As an added bonus, the Saturn edition came with a version of Sega's old arcade game Deep Scan, where you can earn additional credits for the main game. It's hard to believe that Outrun here was released way back in 1986. My 11-year-old self was mesmerized by its sprite scaling power. Often mistakenly referred to as a racing game, this is at its heart a driving simulator. The only opponent here is yourself and a time limit that forces you to try again. Learn where it's best to brake, where it's best to change gears, or where it's best to simply let off the accelerator in your bid to make it across its many stages. Like Afterburner 2, many home ports attempted to capture the arcade feeling of this one, but none did it like the Saturn in 1996. Yeah, it took 10 years before this got a port to rule them all. Not only do you get a beautiful conversion of the arcade original, but in the Japanese standalone release, you get a remixed soundtrack as well. Fortunately, all versions of this come with the enhanced smooth mode, which runs even better than the arcade. Superscalers weren't always done properly on the Saturn, but this one right here was a home run in every single way. Those of us blown away as kids finally had a home version that not only looked the part, but came with extras to make it even more attractive. For me, it remains one of the better driving games for the Sega Saturn.
Checkpoint.
Salamander II was a 1996 shoot-'em-up sequel from Konami that didn't see widespread release outside of Japan. It used both horizontal and vertically scrolling stages as your battlegrounds as you attempted to save the planet Gradius. Yup, Salamander is a spin-off of the other classic Konami shooter series. Salamander II was done on the Konami GX Type 2 arcade system, which features a drastic improvement in sprite and color capabilities. When it came home to the Saturn in 1997, it was a part of the Salamander Deluxe Pack, which included parts 1 and 2 and the closely related Life Force. The Saturn version is a pretty solid representation of the arcade, right down to the spectacular pre-rendered sprites and truly excellent soundtrack. Salamander 2 was something of an average game in regards to its power-up system, but I think the real draw of this one is the trip itself. It's a graphically intensive adventure that always seemed to have the screen full of danger and visually arresting set pieces. I mean, nobody can say this is a poor looking shooter, and once you add a second player via co-op, you can really make this something worth your time. The Salamander games always took a back seat to Konami's other big name shooters, but I still think this one is a very solid game overall, and the Saturn version is a great way to experience it.
Laser. Option C. Twin missile. Option C. Missile Hyper Ray.
Revolution X was a 1994 rail shooter where you must take on a corrupt government and rescue Aerosmith. It used the same arcade hardware as Midway's Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the X unit. You got lots of scaling digitized sprites that at the time actually looked pretty good. When it came home to the Saturn, everything got pixelated to hell, and the end result was a much less visually polished game. The gameplay itself is intact, but I can't say I ever cared for it. The screen is filled with enemies and vehicles shooting at you, so there's never a shoot first and win scenario. Instead, you are shooting to survive and take as little damage as possible, or in other words, you will take mandatory damage no matter how well you play. This quarter-munching mechanic felt like you were just along for the ride and never grabbed me as a must-play. The arcade version was also 3 players at the same time, while the home ports cut that back to 2. The scaling itself is okay in this one, but man, the extreme pixelation shatters any immersion of this world. It's ugly as all get out, and you better have a second player with you to help you pass the time of this unfortunate conversion. When the arcade version of Street Fighter Alpha 3 came out in the summer of 1998, the Saturn was well and truly dead in the West. Even in Japan, the release date for the Dreamcast was set, and the Saturn market was slowly coming to an end there as well. There was simply no chance of seeing this excellent fighter on my favorite 32-bit console. Yet a year later, in 1999, the Saturn did indeed get a port of it, under its Japanese name Street Fighter 03, using the 4MB expanded RAM cartridge to get it as close as possible. And it was close. Like all of the Capcom arcade ports, it had some resolution differences that made the sprites appear larger, but for the overall visuals, this was a really impressive representation of the arcade. Load times were minimal, animations were spot on, and it had a massive roster of fighters to choose from. The Saturn port even had some extra 1 vs 2 and 2 vs 1 modes past what the arcade offered. I still consider this one of the finest home versions of this game because of these extras, and it plays dead on with that glorious Saturn 6-button controller. Alpha 2 was a winner for its excellent use of the bare-bones Saturn hardware, but 03 here is a spectacle beginning to end. It was yet another love letter from Capcom to Sega fandom, thanking them for holding on to the love of 2D gaming for so long. I really wish that Konami had been so honorable.
Nobody blink! Triumph! Oh,
Can't give it up. Go for it, man.
Our final arcade release in this episode is 1994's Virtua Cop. This one was on the Model 2 and featured on-rail shooting action. As a police officer, you are trying to bust an evil crime organization and the leaders that run it. With the Saturn version coming out only a year after the arcade, you would have thought it would have been a disaster. But this was handled internally and the end results are, well, just look at the screens. The Saturn features a cutback in polygons across pretty much everything, but Sega got the general look and feel of this game right on target. This was especially impressive considering you just didn't have a single style of environment. Instead, you are going through shipping yards, warehouses, construction zones, office buildings, and underground hideouts. The gameplay was also really special. While the movement was on rails, the action combat was real time, so where you hit the enemies mattered. You could pop a kneecap, shoot weapons out of their hands, or go for center mass and headshots for the quick kill. You could even score multiple types of hits on a single target. This mattered for your score and bonuses, which if you are playing with a friend, turns this into one heck of a competitive masterpiece. Additional weapon upgrades include automatics, machine guns, rifles, shotguns, and magnums for varying effectiveness. Virtua Cop 2 was another awesome port to the Saturn, but this one will always be something special. It hit right in that first year, and had an option to buy it with one of the best light guns ever created, the Virtua Gun. Now that we are 30 games into the library of Saturn arcade ports, the question is, do you want to see more? Even after 3 episodes, we have only scratched the surface of the total, and we can certainly go further. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a part 4. I was always fascinated with this aspect of gaming back then. Seeing a $10,000 arcade game come home mostly intact was a dream I had since I first started to really pay attention to gaming. I can remember being so disappointed seeing arcade ports getting butchered during the 8 and 16-bit days, so when Saturn showed up, it was a breath of fresh air. It wasn't always perfect, but it was a time when the gap was closing at a pretty substantial rate. By the time the Dreamcast landed, this gap began to disappear entirely, along with the arcade businesses themselves. What used to be at every laundromat, Pizza Hut, bowling alley, convenience store, and pool hall now is relegated to ticket centers in many areas. You have to drive 2 hours from where I live to even find something resembling a real arcade. Keeping that memory alive is really important to me, and I hope it does the same for you. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.